Okay, today we're learning solving equations by factoring. So what we have to do when we're solving equations by factoring, before we begin, the equation must be equal to 0. That's the important part. So like on this first equation right here, it's equal to 0. So since it's equal to 0, I'm ready to go ahead and factor. So I'm going to factor this side. I see that it's a trinomial, so there's 3 terms. And so that's where I do what multiplies to AC, so it multiplies to 12, and adds to B, which is -8. And so what multiplies to 12 and adds to -8 is -6 and -2. So because this begins with just x squared, it's what I would consider the easier kind of factoring. You don't have to do the box. You can go straight to x minus 6 times x minus 2 equals 0. Now that you have it factored, this is just like what we did in 7-4, where you set each factor equal to 0 and solve. So you get x equals 6 when you add 6, and you add the 2, and you get x equals 2. And those are your 2 solutions. So that's pretty much what we're doing today. Let's just continue to do some examples. I'm going to show you some special cases and just make sure we have all the details. So on B, it is not equal to 0. So I need to go ahead and I need to add the 13x to both sides, because what that's going to do is on the right side, it's going to create 0. So I'm going to write 4x squared and then plus 13x and then plus 3. That way it's in standard form. And it's equal to 0. So now that it's equal to 0, I can go ahead and factor. So looking at this, it's a trinomial. It's not the easier kind. I need to use the box. So I'm going to do what multiplies to AC. Okay, A is 4, C is 3, so AC is 12. And it has to add to 13. So make your list if you need to, but I know that it's 1 and 12, because 1 times 12 is 12, 1 plus 12 is 13. So we're not taking a long time to factor because we've been factoring for several days at this point. So remember, since it starts with a 4x squared, you have to make the box. You can't just jump straight to your answer. So kind of a review from factoring, you put 4x squared here, you put the 3 here. So remember the first thing, 4x squared, top left box. Last thing is plus 3, bottom right box. These two numbers, 1 and 12, they replace 13x. So we're going to do 1x, I'm going to put that here, and 12x. I'm going to put that here. Okay, so remember what you do now is you factor out the GCF. So out of the top row, 4x squared and 12x is 4x. Out of the bottom row, out of 1x and 3 is just 1, and it's positive. And so this top must be x. You can look at it 2 ways. Remember, this, you can say what's the GCF of the first row, and out of 4x squared and x is x. Or you can say 4x times what would give me 4x squared. And there's kind of 2 ways to figure it out. So same thing on the second row. You can either find the GCF of 12x and 3, or you can ask yourself what times 4x would make 12x. So I get 4x plus 1 and x plus 3. Okay, so you found your factors. Once you found your factors, you just set them equal to 0 and solve. So on this first one, we subtract 1 from both sides, and then we divide by 4. So I get -1/4. That's one answer. And then on this one, I subtract 3 from both sides, and I get -3. That's your other answer. Okay, let's try some more. We're doing the same thing here. So on C, we can't factor yet because it's not equal to 0. So what we have to do first is we have to subtract the 30 to the other side. So now you can't combine the 13x and the 30. They're not like terms. So just write x squared plus 13x minus 30 equals 0. Okay, once it's equal to 0, now you're ready to factor. So you factor the left side. So remember, this is a trinomial. So we just do what multiplies to AC and adds to B. So let's see here. This one's a little harder because at first I want to say it's 10 and 3. But one has to be positive and one has to be negative, so that doesn't work. I think it's actually 15 and 2, because 15 times 2 is 30. So I think it's 15 and -2. So because it starts with just x squared, this is the easier kind where you can jump straight to using your 15 and -2 to write your factors. And so now you've factored, you've done the hard part. Set each factor equal to 0 and solve. So since there's two factors, you're going to get two solutions. So we get x equals negative 15, and we add the 2, and we get x equals 2. Okay, let's keep going. So on D, this one is already equal to 0. However, I see it's one of those special cases. If you notice, it starts with a negative, and when the a value starts with a negative, remember you're supposed to factor it out first, okay? So we can factor it out. We can put a negative, and that's going to make it be 5m squared. And then instead of plus 6m, it switches it to minus 6m. Instead of minus 1, remember it switches it to plus 1. Okay, it's already equal to 0, so we're ready to factor. So we're going to go ahead and factor the 5m squared minus 6m plus 1. This is what we're factoring, okay, this highlighted part. So don't go back to the original. So I'm going to jump out to the side here and do it. It's what multiplies to AC. 5 times 1 is 5. And it has to add to negative 6. So I'd say that's negative 5 and negative 1. Now, because it starts with 5m squared, don't just put x minus 5 or m minus 5, m minus 1. You got to do the box. So remember how we find what's in the box. This is review. The factoring part we've been doing, the only thing new is that whole solving thing where we actually set it equal to 0 and solve. So this first term, 5m squared, comes here, top left corner. The last term, this plus 1, comes to the bottom right corner. Okay, these two numbers, negative 5 and negative 1, you got to put m with them. It's negative 5m, negative 1m. And the reason it's okay to use is because they create negative 5 minus 1 makes negative 6m. That's why this is okay. So 5m is the GCF of the top row, minus 1 is the GCF there. This first column is m. Quick check, 5m times m is 5m squared. Negative 1 times m is negative 1m. All right, and then this is, let's see, a negative 1. And remember, if this top right box is negative, you pull out a negative number. Do a quick check. Negative 1 times 5m is negative 5m. And then check negative 1 times negative 1 is 1. So that's good. So we have 5m minus 1 and m minus 1. All right. So now you set each factor equal to 0 and solve. So set 5m minus 1 equal to 0 and m minus 1 equal to 0. So we add the 1. We get 5m equals 1. Divide by 5. So that's m is 1/5. That's one answer. Add the 1. You get m equals 1. That's your other answer. And this just gets, the better we get at factoring, the easier this will become. Okay, on E, it's already equal to 0, so we are ready to factor. This is the easy kind of factoring. If you recognize this, there's a binomial, two terms, and it's subtracting, and you can square root both things. So remember, this is called difference of squares. So you square root the 4x squared, you get 2x. You square root the 9, you get a 3. 1's plus, 1's minus. All right, so now that you factored it, set each factor equal to 0 and solve. So you've got to get it equal to 0, then you factor it, and then once it's factored, you set each factor equal to 0 and find what x actually equals. So I subtract 3, then I divide by 2, and you can put this as negative 3 halves or as negative 1.5. Either way, it's okay. So on this one, you add 3, 2x equals 3. Divide by 2. So x equals positive 3 halves or positive 1.5. Okay, one of the coolest tricks I'm going to teach you is how to deal with fractions. So when I see these fractions, this, like we could factor this, but it would not be great. Like it would be kind of hard. So what I see here is I see this denominator, the bottom number is 3, and this denominator is 9. So I want to choose the least common multiple. What the least common multiple is the lowest number that they can both multiply to. So here's how you figure that out. You think about like 3 times 2 is 6, 3 times 3 is 9, 3 times 4 is 12, 3 times 5 is 15, so on. And you think about 9 times 1, 9 times 2, 9 times 3, and so on. You choose the lowest number they both can get to. All right, they can both get to a 9. So what I want you to do is I want you to take both sides of this equation times 9. And as long as what you do to one side, you do to the other side, you're fine. It's totally okay. So 9 times x squared is 9x squared. 9 times 2/3, you can totally do in a calculator, you get 6x. And 9 times 1/9, still can do in a calculator, you get 1. On the right side, 0 times 9 is still 0. So what's awesome about clearing the fractions is now your fractions are gone, and all of a sudden this is a much easier problem. So now we're back to normal. What multiplies to AC? That's 9. And it's got to add to B. So that'd be 3 and 3. Multiply to 9, add to 6. And remember, because it starts with 9x squared, you got to do the box. So 9x squared goes here, 1 goes here, and your number's 3. Don't forget the x's with them. I see that a lot. Put 3x in both spots. Okay, let's factor out the GCF. I have 3x plus 1 and 3x plus 1. All right, so there's my factors. Now, notice they're the exact same parentheses, so you really don't have to set them both equal to 0 because they're identical. So we can go ahead and subtract the 1 and divide by 3, and I get negative 1/3. And you don't have to do the other one because it's also 3x plus 1. Since they were exactly the same, this one only is going to have one answer because they just have repeated solutions. Now, write this one as a fraction because if you put it as a decimal, putting negative 0.3, that's not the same thing. So you got to put negative 1/3 because you don't want to have to round it off. That's not quite accurate. Okay, so let's look at this one. The only denominator is 4. That's the bottom number of a fraction. So multiply both sides of this fraction times 4, or both sides of the equation, I'm sorry, times 4. So you have 4 times x squared, that's 4x squared. 4 times 3x, that's 12x. 4 times 9/4, you can do that in a calculator as needed, that's 9. On the right side, 0 times 4 is 0. Okay, so by getting rid of that fraction, you made it so much easier. So it multiplies to AC, adds to B. That's going to be 6 and 6. Because it starts with a 4x squared, not just an x squared, you need to go ahead and you need to use the box. All right, 4x squared, the 9's here, and it's 6x and 6x. So factor out the GCF, the first row, that's 2x. The next row is 3, positive 3. And this is 2x again, and this happens to also be 3. So this is another one where like the factors are exactly the same. And remember, when that happens, just set each one equal to 0 and solve. We're going to subtract 3. We get negative 3 and divide by 2. So negative 3/2 or negative 1.5 is okay. The reason it's okay to put as a decimal is because it's literally exactly the same thing. You're not rounding it off. We don't have to do this other one because it is the same as the first, like the first factor, the first parentheses. So it's not going to give you a different answer. That's why there's only one answer on this one. Okay, last but not least is this one. So we're going to first subtract the 200 so that it moves to the other side because it must be equal to 0 before we start. So I get 18x squared minus, 200. Okay, I see there's a GCF here. They're both even, so a 2 can come out. I'm going to take a 2 out. I'm going to have 9x squared minus 100. Now, when it is 9x squared minus 100, that right there, this thing, 9x squared minus 100, this is difference of squares. It is both perfect squares. We can square root them. They're subtracting, and it's a binomial. So remember, you square root it, you get 3x. Square root of 100 is 10. And then 1's plus and 1's minus. That 2's just chilling outside. It doesn't really do much. And set each factor equal to 0 and solve. So we're going to add the 10 and divide by 3. And once again, that's going to give me a decimal that is repeating, and I don't want that to happen. So I'm just going to leave it as 10/3. And then subtract the 10 from both sides and divide by 3. And that's negative 10/3. And that's how we're just going to leave our answers, is positive 10/3 and negative 10/3. So really working on our factoring and getting better at it is going to make solving very easy. We've just got to be awesome at factoring first.